If you see me in aisle 14 of the Home Depot in Dayton, Ohio, on a Saturday morning, you are not going to look twice. You will see a man in a faded Carhartt jacket, boots that have been resoled twice, and a 2011 Ford F1. 5-0 out in the parking lot with a dent in the tailgate that I have absolutely no intention of fixing. If we end up in the checkout line together, we might nod at each other, maybe complain about the rising price of 2x4s, and then we will go our separate ways. You will drive home thinking you just met a retired foreman, or maybe a guy who runs a local plumbing route. And that is exactly by design. People talk about the millionaire next door like it is some kind of cute, quirky lifestyle choice. They think it is about clipping coupons or refusing to buy a Rolex because you want to stay grounded. But humility has nothing to do with it. Looking like you belong to the working class when you have long since bought the factory is not a personality quirk. It is a tactical shield. My name is Frank Clayton. For the last 30 years, I have quietly built a logistics and metal fabrication empire across the American Midwest that currently clears somewhere north of $400 million a year. We own the trucks, we own the warehouses, and we manufacture the parts that keep the lights on in cities you have never even visited. But you will never see my name on a rich list, and you will never see Clayton Marsh Industries tied directly to my personal bank account. If you want to survive in the deep end of the ocean, you do not just put on a cheap shirt and hope nobody asks questions. You have to build a fortress out of paperwork. My ownership of this empire is buried so deep, it would give a forensic accountant a migraine. Clayton Marsh Industries operates underneath a labyrinth of Delaware LLCs, which are in turn wholly owned by a blind trust legally domiciled in Wyoming. If you look up the corporate registry, the board of directors reports to a faceless private equity holding group. Only 3 elite corporate attorneys know that the shadowy holding group is actually just me, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, signing the final approvals. To the rest of the world, I am just a ghost with a decent credit score. They say that new money shouts and old money whispers. I have always found both of those options a little too noisy, because the truth is, real power does not need to make a sound at all. Real power is sitting across a dinner table wearing a $15 flannel shirt, listening to an enemy threaten to destroy everything you have built, and quietly letting him believe he holds all the cards. I am going to tell you exactly how I let a man dig his own grave using nothing but his own manufactured grievance. But to understand how we got to that dinner table, I need to take you back to the very beginning. If you want to understand the architecture of a decades-long grudge, you have to go back to the days when the air smelled like machine oil and ozone. It was 1989. The Rust Belt was still trying to figure out how to survive the decade, and Victor Marsh and I were 2 20-something kids with a pair of second-hand welding rigs, a lease on a drafty cinderblock garage in Columbus, and a dangerous amount of ambition. We built Clayton Marsh from the dirt up. For 4 years, we practically lived in that shop, eating cold diner sandwiches over blueprints and shaking hands with local foremen to win every scrap of business we could find. Victor was my brother in every way that mattered, or so I thought. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely announces itself with a smoking gun. Usually, it looks like a rounding error. It was a freezing Tuesday night in November. Victor had gone home, and I stayed late to reconcile the month's invoices under the buzz of a dying fluorescent bulb. We didn't have spreadsheets back then. We had heavy, green-lined paper ledgers. I was tracing a discrepancy in our materials budget when my finger stopped on a vendor name I didn't recognize. Then I found another. And another. I spent the next 7 hours pulling every receipt, every canceled check, and every bank statement we had. By the time the sun came up, the cold in my bones had nothing to do with the weather. Victor wasn't just skimming off the top. He was bleeding us dry. He had set up a dummy corporation under his wife's maiden name and was funneling our cash into it to buy his own equipment. Worse, he was actively poaching our biggest clients, using the Rolodex we built together to undercut our own bids. He was building his parachute with my silk. When Victor walked into the office at 8 that morning, holding 2 cups of coffee and smiling like everything was right in the world, I didn't throw a punch. I didn't yell. Anger is loud, but absolute resolve is dead quiet. I simply slid a 3-inch thick manila folder across the battered metal desk we shared. Inside was every forged signature, every diverted check, and every fraudulent invoice I had spent the night the photocopying. I looked him dead in the eye and gave him a choice. He could sign over his entire stake in the company right then and walk out the door with nothing but the clothes on his back, or I could take that folder straight down to the district attorney's office, where he would be charged with felony wire fraud and spend the best years of his life in a 6x8 cell. Victor looked at the papers, looked at me, and realized he was already a ghost. He picked up a pen, signed the dissolution papers with a shaking hand, and walked out into the cold morning air. I never spoke to him again. But here is the detail that would eventually come back to haunt my dinner table over 30 years later. Victor had a younger brother named Stuart. Stuart was 12 years old at the time, and he idolized Victor. Now, when a man's ego is completely shattered by his own cowardice, he has a choice. He can admit his failures, or he can rewrite history. Victor chose the latter. He couldn't bear to tell his little brother that he was a common thief. So, for the next 3 decades, Victor spun a tragic, masterful lie. He told Stuart that Frank Cololton was a ruthless corporate shark who had squeezed him out, stolen his life's work, and left him with nothing. Victor Marsh died of lung cancer years later, taking his guilt to the grave. But the lie survived. It buried itself deep in young Stuart's mind, festering and growing into a quiet, lifelong obsession. And 30 years later, that 12-year-old boy would grow up, have a son of his own, and decide it was finally time to settle the score. Fast forward to 3 Thanksgivings ago, the business in Columbus had grown from that cinder-block garage into an empire, and my daughter, Lacey, had grown into a sharp, fiercely independent woman. She had my stubbornness and her mother's intellect, and as of her 25th birthday, she was also the majority shareholder of the family trust. She knew exactly how our wealth was structured, and she knew the importance of playing the part. To the outside world, she was a mid-level marketing manager living comfortably but modestly. Then she brought Clayton Hale home for dinner. Clayton was everything I naturally distrust in a man. He was polished to a high sheen, an Ivy League MBA type who wore expensive loafers and spoke with the kind of practiced confidence that only comes from never having the world tell you no. But as I watched him in my living room, laughing with Lacey and helping clear the dishes, I had to admit something to myself. He wasn't a bad kid. He was sharp, driven, and clearly head over heels for my daughter. Lacey pulled me aside into the kitchen that night. She told me things were getting serious. So, I did what any protective father who secretly commands a multi-million-dollar corporate intelligence apparatus would do. I had him vetted. The report that came back on Clayton Hale was spotless. His numbers at his previous firm were stellar. His management instincts were aggressive but sound, and his background check was clean. I saw an opportunity, not just to test the man my daughter loved, but to secure the future of the company. The CEO position at Colton Marsh happened to be opening up. I set the wheels in motion. Clayton received a call from an elite executive search firm, a firm that answered directly to my lawyers. He was headhunted for the CEO role of a major logistics conglomerate backed by a private equity group. Over the next 6 weeks, Clayton ran a gauntlet of grueling interviews with my board of directors. He sweated, he prepared, and he fought for that job. And he earned it entirely on his own merit. When the board finally called to offer him the position, with a compensation package that made him physically sit down, he had no idea that the man rubber-stamping the offer letter was his future father-in-law, drinking black coffee in a flannel shirt just 50 miles away. When Lacey and Clayton got engaged 6 months later, we had to navigate the most dangerous part of the illusion, the marriage. You cannot hide $500 million from a spouse without some incredibly creative legal footwork. I sat Lacey down in my study. We brought in the heavy hitters, the estate lawyers who specialize in making vast sums of money look incredibly boring. They drafted an ironclad prenuptial agreement, presented to Clayton not as the safeguarding of an empire, but as the protection of Lacey's grandfather's modest estate and a few family landholdings. We buried the Colton Marsh equity deep inside the Wyoming Trust, completely isolated from any marital assets. Clayton signed it without a second thought. He was making fantastic money as the hotshot new CEO. He didn't care about what he thought was a quaint family inheritance. For their first year of marriage, Lacey and Clayton filed their taxes as married filing separately, a move Clayton assumed was just a quirk of Lacey's financial independence. For 14 months, the illusion held perfectly. Clayton went to work on the 19th floor, running the day-to-day operations of Colton Marsh Industries, presenting quarterly reports to a board that answered to me. At night, he came home to Lacey, none the wiser, and on the weekends we would all sit on my back porch, drinking cheap beer, while Clayton carefully avoided talking too much about work, out of what he thought was a polite desire not to bore his simple, blue-collar father-in-law. It was the perfect arrangement, until the past finally caught up with us, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a 30-year-old grudge. For 14 months, the honeymoon phase was in full swing, and I don't just mean the marriage. Clayton was crushing it in the corner office. He restructured our Midwest distribution chain, saving the company north of $4 million a year, and he did it without bruising the egos of the old-timers on the warehouse floor. Sitting in my study, reviewing the quarterly reports he had submitted to my board, I had to begrudgingly admit that my son-in-law was exactly the leader Colton Marsh needed. We had found a rhythm. Then the weather changed. It didn't happen all at once. Sabotage rarely does. It starts with a slight shift in the wind, a conversation that feels just a few degrees off-center. Clayton's father, Stuart, I had recently moved closer to the city, and suddenly Clayton's demeanor began to subtly fray. The confident, easygoing young man who drank cheap beer on my porch was replaced by someone tense and guarded. Lacey was the first to wave a red flag. She came over one Sunday afternoon, poured herself a cup of tea, and leaned against my kitchen counter with a frown. Clayton had been asking questions. Strange, probing questions. He wanted to know about the early days of my career. He asked her if I had ever crossed paths with the founders of Colton Marsh since we operated in the same state and the same industry back in the 80s. Lacey, bless her, played dumb effortlessly, but she warned me that Clayton seemed deeply conflicted, like a man carrying a weight he didn't know how to set down. I knew then that someone was whispering in his ear. The confirmation came on a Thursday evening. My phone buzzed, and it was Clayton. His voice was tight, overly formal, stripped of the warmth we had built over the last couple of years. He told me his parents were in town and that his father, Stuart, wanted to take us all out to dinner to finally meet properly. He named the restaurant. It was a downtown steakhouse, the kind of obscenely expensive, dimly lit establishment where the steaks are $150 a la carte. The menus don't list prices, and the waiters wear better tailored suits than the customers. It is a place designed for power plays and intimidation, not getting to know your son's father-in-law. When he said the name of the restaurant, a very old, very familiar alarm bell went off in my gut. If you survive 3 decades in business, you learn never to ignore that instinct. It is the primitive part of your brain recognizing a predator in the tall grass before your eyes can actually see the stripes. I'd love to, I told Clayton, keeping my voice as mild and pleasant as a Sunday morning. Tell me what time. The moment we hung up, I walked into my study, locked the door, and made a phone call to the head of my corporate intelligence team. I gave him the name Stuart Hale and told him to dig. I wanted everything: birth certificates, property records, and family trees. It took them less than 2 hours to find the ghost. Stuart Hale was born Stuart Hale Marsh. He had quietly dropped his last name professionally years ago, but the bloodline was undeniable. He was Victor Marsh's younger brother. The 12-year-old boy who had been fed a lifetime of toxic lies had finally tracked me down. Stuart had realized that his son was the CEO of the company he believed I stole from his family. He had realized his son was married to my daughter, and now he was using Clayton to orchestrate an ambush. I sat back in my leather chair staring at the dossier on my desk. I felt a brief pang of sympathy for Clayton, realizing the young man was caught in the middle of a decades-old vendetta he didn't even understand. But mostly, I felt the cold, familiar calm that washes over you right before a storm breaks. Stuart Hale had invited me to a fancy steakhouse. He thought he had the upper hand. He thought he was luring a simple retired blue-collar worker into a trap where he could dictate the terms of my surrender. He had no idea that I wasn't walking into his trap. I was bringing the entire fortress with me. I walked into the steakhouse wearing exactly what I wanted to wear: a clean but well-worn flannel shirt, dark denim, and a pair of boots that had seen more dirt than the valet stand out front had ever encountered. The maitre d' physically hesitated before taking my coat, scanning the room as if trying to figure out which table had ordered a lumberjack. I spotted them immediately. Stuart and Norma Hale were tucked into a plush corner booth, looking like a spread from a luxury lifestyle magazine. Stuart wore a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than my first mortgage, his cufflinks catching the low ambient light. Norma was draped in cashmere, her smile fixed and tight. And there was Clayton, sitting next to Lacey, wearing a sharp jacket, but looking utterly miserable. His shoulders were drawn, his eyes constantly darting toward the table setting. He knew a collision was coming, even if he didn't grasp the true speed of the trains. Stuart stood up the moment I approached, flashing a predatory, brilliant smile. He extended his hand, using the classic double-handed shake, gripping my right hand while clapping his left over the top. It is a gesture meant to convey warmth, but in the boardroom, it is a physical assertion of dominance. "Frank, it is so good to finally sit down together," he said, his voice dripping with practiced charm. "Stuart," I replied, pulling my hand back gently but firmly. "Nice place you picked." We sat. The waiter materialized, hovering nervously until we ordered drinks. For the first 20 minutes, we played the game. We talked about the weather, Lacey and Clayton's recent trip to the coast, and the ridiculous traffic downtown. Norma complimented Lacey's dress. Stuart asked polite, empty questions about my garden back home. It was the careful, delicate choreography that always precedes an execution. Then the main courses arrived. The plates were set down, the waiter retreated, and the temperature at the table dropped 10 degrees. Stuart reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He moved slowly, making sure every eye at the table was on his hand. He pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope and placed it dead center on the white tablecloth, right between my steak and his. He rested his fingertips on it for a second longer than necessary. "Frank," Stuart began, his voice dropping an octave, shedding the polite dinner party tone entirely. "I think it's time we talk about Victor." Beside me, Lacey went perfectly still. Clayton looked down at his plate, the muscles in his jaw clenching. "My brother," Stuart clarified, his eyes locking onto mine, searching for the panic he was certain would be there. "Victor Marsh?" I didn't blink. I didn't reach for my water. I just looked at him. "I know who you are, Frank," Stuart continued, leaning forward, the anger finally bleeding through the veneer. "I know what you did to him in 1989. You squeezed him out, you stole his equity, you threatened him with ruin, and you built an empire on his blood and sweat. He died with nothing because of you." He tapped the envelope. "Inside here is a very simple proposal. It outlines a restitution payment to my family, an 8-figure settlement quietly paid to right a 30-year wrong. It also outlines your immediate resignation from whatever advisory capacity you still hold with Clayton Marsh. If you refuse, I go to the press. I go to the board. And I will have my son, the CEO of your company, launch a full internal investigation into the origins of Clayton Marsh Industries. We will drag your name through the mud, Frank. We will burn your legacy to the ground." Stuart leaned back, crossing his arms. He had delivered his strike. He was waiting for the old man in the flannel shirt to crumble, to beg, to try and negotiate. I picked up my fork. I cut a piece of my steak, chewed it slowly, and swallowed. I let the silence stretch. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. The psychology of a pause is a devastating weapon. When a man delivers an ultimatum, his adrenaline spikes. He expects a reaction: anger, fear, denial. When you give him nothing, that adrenaline has nowhere to go. It turns back on him. It curdles into doubt. 30 seconds. Norma shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Clayton finally looked up, staring at me with a mixture of terror and confusion. Stuart's confident smirk began to waver, the corners of his mouth tightening as the silence dragged on, suffocating the table. After a full minute, I set my fork down, dabbed my mouth with a linen napkin, and finally looked Stuart dead in the eyes. "Stuart," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady. "You really should have asked Victor why he never came after me himself." Stuart's jaw tightened, a flash of genuine confusion breaking through his manufactured anger. Before he could speak, I reached down beside my chair and lifted my own folder onto the table. It wasn't a crisp, a cream-colored envelope born from a high-end law firm. It was a battered, 30-year-old manila folder, the edges soft and frayed from decades of sitting in a fireproof safe. I flipped it open and slid the first document across the white tablecloth. "This is a bank ledger from November of 1989, I said, my voice barely above a murmur, yet carrying across the table like a gunshot. "Notice the highlighted withdrawals. Those correspond directly to wire transfers sent to a dummy corporation registered under Victor's wife's maiden name." I slid the next paper over. "These are the forged invoices he used to hide the missing capital." I didn't stop. I laid out the evidence methodically, overlapping the documents like playing cards. "This is a sworn, notarized affidavit from Dale Pewitt, the accountant who helped Victor cook the books. I had him update his statement last week. He's 71, playing a lot of golf in Florida, and perfectly happy to testify under oath about how your brother systematically embezzled from Colton Marsh." Stewart stared at the papers, his face drained of color, his eyes darting across the faded ink and the undeniable signatures of his hero. "This is manufactured," he choked out, his voice thin and reedy. "You faked this." "You know I didn't, Stewart," I said gently, "because deep down, you always knew Victor was a coward. He lied to you because he couldn't look his 12-year-old brother in the eye and admit he was a common thief. I gave him a choice to walk away, and he took it. He didn't die with nothing because of me. He died with nothing because he was a crook who finally ran out of other people's money." The reality of the documents crushed whatever argument Stewart had left. He realized, in a horrifying instant, that the crusade he had built his entire adult life around was entirely fabricated. But desperation makes men foolish. Instead of retreating, Stewart grasped at the only weapon he thought he still had. He turned violently toward his son. "It doesn't matter," Stewart hissed, his face flushed. "Clayton runs the company now. He's the CEO. He can tear your operations apart from the inside. We'll bankrupt you from the top down." Clayton flinched as if he had been struck. He opened his mouth, torn between the father who raised him and the mounting evidence of a catastrophic lie. I looked at Clayton, and for the first time that evening, I felt a deep ache in my chest for the kid. I reached out and gently placed my hand flat on the table. "Clayton," I said, capturing his full attention, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. The executive search firm that headhunted you 14 months ago? I own it. The board of directors you report to every quarter? They are on my payroll. That private equity holding group in Wyoming that theoretically owns Colton Marsh Industries? It is a blind trust, and I am the sole trustee." Clayton's brow furrowed, a profound and paralyzing confusion washing over his features. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. "I am talking about the fact that you do not work for a faceless conglomerate, Clayton," I said, dropping the final, devastating truth onto the table. "I own Colton Marsh Industries. Every truck, every warehouse, every single share. And because of the prenuptial agreement you signed, thinking you were protecting a quaint family estate, your wife sitting next to you holds the majority stake." I let the words settle into the dead air between us. "You don't hold the keys to the castle, Clayton," I said softly. "I do. You have been sitting in a chair that I built, in an office that I own, running a company that belongs entirely to my family." I watched Clayton's psychological system undergo a complete and total failure. His eyes moved from me to Lacey, who offered him a sad, apologetic nod, and finally to his father. The polished Ivy League CEO vanished. In his place was a young man whose entire professional and personal reality had just been inverted in the span of 3 minutes. He realized he was not the master of his universe. He was an actor standing on a stage I had constructed, reading lines I had approved. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the heavy, atmospheric pressure of a room where every single dynamic of power had just been violently reversed. Stuart sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, staring at me as if I had just materialized out of thin air. He had walked into this restaurant believing he was cornering a retired, blue-collar relic. He was just now realizing he had walked willingly into the jaws of a corporate titan, and the trap had slammed shut the moment he sat down. Panic is a fascinating thing to watch in a man who usually hides behind expensive tailoring. Stuart's eyes darted wildly between the faded embezzlement records and my perfectly calm demeanor. He realized his extortion plot was dead, but pride is a stubborn disease, and rather than accept the brutal reality of his defeat, Stuart scrambled for his last remaining lifeline. He turned to Clayton. "Clayton!" Stuart urged, his voice cracking, shedding the polished baritone he had used all evening. "Clayton, listen to me. This man has been lying to you. Your own wife has been lying to you. We are your family. We can still fight this. You know the inner workings of his company now. You have access. We can build a case. We can leverage the media. We can—" "Stop!" The word didn't come from me. It came from Clayton. It wasn't yelled, but it cut through Stuart's frantic pleading like a scalpel. Clayton finally looked away from the documents and stared directly at his father. The confusion and shock that had paralyzed him moments ago were rapidly burning away, replaced by a cold, clarifying anger. He was looking at Stuart not as a son looking at a father, but as a man looking at a stranger who had tried to use him as a pawn. "You knew," Clayton said, his voice deadly quiet. "You knew who Frank was. You knew who Lacey was. You found out, and instead of telling me, you let me marry her. You let me take this job. You smiled at our wedding, knowing you were going to use my life as a Trojan horse for a shakedown." Stuart reached across the table, his hand trembling. "I did this for us, for Victor, for our legacy." Clayton recoiled from his father's touch, his expression twisting into absolute disgust. He looked down at the 30-year-old bank ledgers, the undeniable mathematical proof of his uncle's guilt. "There is no legacy," Clayton said. "Victor was a thief, and you used my marriage to try and extort my father-in-law over a fairy tale." Clayton stood up. He didn't slam his hands on the table. He didn't raise his voice to draw the attention of the surrounding diners. He just adjusted his jacket with a terrifying, professional calm that I recognized immediately. It was the exact demeanor I used when firing a liability. "Take your envelope," Clayton told his father. "Pay for your own dinner, and do not ever contact my wife again." Stuart looked up at his son, his face crumbling. He opened his mouth to argue, to plead, to salvage some scrap of dignity, but there was nothing left. Norma, who had been deathly silent the entire ordeal, finally put a trembling hand on Stuart's arm. She knew it was over. Without another word, Stuart Hale picked up the cream-colored envelope. It looked incredibly small in his hands now. He stood, refusing to meet my eyes, and offered Clayton one last desperate look. Clayton turned his back. Stuart and Norma walked away from the table, their posture broken, navigating the dim, crowded restaurant until they vanished out the front doors. They had come to burn an empire, and they left carrying nothing but the ashes of a 30-year lie. I sat quietly, watching them go. I didn't feel triumphant or vindictive. I just felt the quiet, settling relief of a book finally being closed and put back on the shelf. With Stuart gone, the air at the table cleared, leaving just the three of us sitting in the wreckage of the evening. Clayton sat back down slowly, staring at the empty space where his father had been. He looked exhausted, or like a man who had just run a marathon only to realize he had been running in the wrong direction the entire time. I poured a glass of water and slid it over to him. He took it, drank deeply, and then finally looked at me. "Was it all a test?" he asked, his voice raw. "The job? The board? Me?" "The hiring was a test," I admitted softly. "I needed to know if the man my daughter loved was capable of handling the weight of this family. You passed that test months ago, Clayton. You earned that office. But tonight—" I nodded toward the empty chairs across from us. "Tonight was the final interview. I needed to know what you would do when forced to choose between a comfortable lie and a brutal truth. You chose the truth. That is why you still have a job tomorrow morning." Clayton let out a long, ragged breath, processing the immense gravity of the moment. He turned to Lacey, who had been quietly watching him, her eyes filled with a complicated mix of guilt and pride. "We have to go home," Clayton said to her, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We have a lot to talk about." I paid the bill, leaving a massive tip for the waiter who had the good sense to keep our glasses full and stay out of the crossfire. We walked out into the cool night air, said our brief goodbyes, and I watched Clayton and Lacey get into their car. I knew exactly what was going to happen when they got back to their house. Clayton was going to demand answers. He was going to stand in their kitchen and confront his wife about the 14 months of deception. Lacey wouldn't hide behind excuses. She would apologize for the secrecy, but she would also explain the sheer, terrifying weight of protecting a legacy from people exactly like his father. She would explain that the prenup wasn't a lack of love, but a wall built to keep the wolves out. And then, because they are both smart and deeply committed to each other, they would agree to tear down the walls between them. They would agree to burn the illusion. No more secrets. No more playing the part of the mid-level marketing manager and the head-hunted executive. They would finally start their marriage as absolute equals, partners in an empire that Clayton now truly understood. As for me, I climbed into the cab of my 2011 Ford F-150. The engine turned over with a comforting, familiar rumble. I drove out of the city, leaving the glass towers and the high-end steakhouses in the rearview mirror. Fast forward a few weeks, and things at Colton Marsh Industries have settled into a new, far more honest rhythm. Clayton is still in the corner office on the 19th floor, running the day-to-day operations with the same ruthless efficiency. But now, when he submits his quarterly reports to the board, he occasionally adds a private note at the bottom, just for me. The dynamic has shifted from a silent manipulation to a profound, unspoken, mutual respect. I pulled into my driveway that night, the headlights sweeping across my modest, single-story house. I parked, grabbed my keys, and walked around to the backyard. The moon was bright enough to cast long shadows across my garden. I walked over to the tomato plants, checking the soil, breathing in the damp, rich smell of the earth. I stood there in my flannel shirt and my battered boots, listening to the quiet of the Ohio night. People spend their entire lives trying to look rich, buying expensive suits and dining in restaurants where they don't list the prices, all to prove to the world that they matter. But true wealth, the kind that survives betrayals and outlasts generations, isn't about what you show the world. It is about what you can protect. I smiled, reached down to pick a perfectly ripe tomato, and went inside my quiet, ordinary house, knowing that my empire and my family were finally entirely safe.